I never thought a simple family cookout would lead to the neighborhood association president forbidding my whole family from coming to see me, but when they messed with a federal judge's kid, they never thought he'd use his legal skills to forbid them from the whole county. What would you do if someone tried to stop your relatives from seeing you? The smell of cooking hamburgers filled my yard as my sister, Mary, chased her laughing children through the water sprinkler. After 6 months of not seeing them, this weekend visit was very important to me. I'd moved to Willow Creek Homes just 3 months earlier, attracted by the pretty parks and tidy streets. Nobody told me about Susan Smith. "Excuse me, what exactly is going on here?" A harsh voice interrupted our fun. I looked up to see a woman in her 50s with neat blonde hair walking across my grass. Her flowery shirt was buttoned all the way up, even though it was summer, and she held a clipboard like a shield. "Just having a family cookout," I answered, holding a spatula. "I'm John Davis, just moved in. Can I help you?" Her eyes got smaller as she looked at my sister's children. "Are these people approved visitors?" My sister, Mary, looked at me, puzzled. I was just as confused. "Approved? They're my family, visiting for the weekend." Susan's back became straighter. "I'm Susan Smith, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Our rules say all visitors must be registered with the HOA office 72 hours before they come." I laughed, thinking she was kidding. The kids stopped playing, noticing the tension. "That can't be right. Nobody told me about registering family when I got the house." "It's in the agreement you signed, Mr. Davis. Page 47, Rule 3.12, she said, pointing to my sister's car in the driveway. "Unregistered visitors, noise problems, and that car is parked wrong." My sister spoke up. "The kids are just having fun. They're not being too loud." Susan ignored her completely. "As HOA president, I have to make sure our community rules are followed. This is your first official warning," she wrote something on her clipboard. "3 warnings mean you have to pay fines." I put down my spatula. "Look, I didn't know about this rule. Now I know I'll register them first thing Monday." "That's not how it works. They have to leave right now and come back after they're properly registered." Susan smiled tightly. "Rules keep our home values high, Mr. Davis." My dad, who had been quietly watching from the porch, stood up. At 65, Judge Robert Davis still had a powerful presence, without shouting. "Susan, is it? I'm John's father. Are you saying my grandkids can't visit their uncle without filling out forms?" Susan's eyes got a little bigger. "And you are?" "Robert Davis, Federal Judge, Eastern District." I saw her think quickly. She straightened her shirt. "Even judges have to follow HOA rules, sir. The rules are for everyone." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting idea. I'd like to see the legal proof that an HOA can stop family visits on private property." Susan turned red. "The agreement is a contract, Judge Davis. Your son agreed to these rules." "Did the rules clearly say family members need permission beforehand?" Dad asked calmly. "It says all visitors. Now I'll ignore this problem just this once." Her voice made it sound like she was doing us a huge favor. "But make sure all future visitors are properly registered." As she walked away, Dad sat back down. Interesting woman. "Sorry about that," I told Mary. "Neighborhood drama. Does she always check people's backyards?" Mary asked. "First time I've seen her. Probably nothing to worry about." We went back to our cookout, but something felt wrong. The happy mood was gone. My nephew Jack, only 7, asked if they were going to be kicked out of my house. "Of course not, buddy," I told him. "That lady is just very strict about rules." Later that night, after the kids were in bed, my father and I sat on the porch with drinks. "That HOA president," Dad said quietly. "She reminds me of cases I've had." "What kind of cases?" "People who think authority means power." He took a drink. I'd suggest reading your HOA agreement very carefully, son. I shrugged. It's probably nothing, just a board member who cares too much. Maybe. Dad didn't sound sure. But in my experience, people who watch children playing in backyards rarely stop there. I didn't know then how right he was, or that Susan Smith had cameras put up at all neighborhood entrances, or that she was already sending emails to other board members about my bad attitude about community rules. My sister's family left Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, I found an official written warning on my door, listing 3 violations from the weekend, and a flyer announcing the neighborhood 4th of July party, with Susan Smith as the main guest. I had no idea then that this was just the start, or that my quiet father was already planning how to handle what was coming next. Happy birthday to you! Mom's singing filled my kitchen as she brought in a chocolate cake with candles. Dad followed with a wrapped gift. Their surprise visit for my 35th birthday made me feel better after a tough week at work. You guys didn't have to come 3 hours, I said, really touched. Nonsense, Mom replied, putting down the cake. We'd never miss your birthday. We went to the front porch with cold drinks, enjoying the nice evening. Dad asked about work, and I told them about my recent job promotion. Everything felt great, until I saw a dark SUV slowly driving past my house. It went around the block twice. Someone looking for a place? Mom wondered. The SUV parked across the street. Susan Smith got out, along with a man with little hair in a golf shirt and a thin woman with glasses. They walked toward my house like soldiers. "John Davis!" Susan called out before even getting to my walkway. "Those people on your porch need to be named immediately." My stomach felt tight. "These are my parents, Susan. They surprised me for my birthday." The man with little hair took out a tablet. "No visitor registration on file. That's violation number 2, Davis. I'm Mark Green, HOA Vice President," he added with clear satisfaction. "And this is Diana Perkins, our secretary." Susan stepped onto my first porch step, uninvited. "Unregistered guests are not allowed. We're very serious about community safety." My mother looked confused. "Safety? We're just visiting our son, ma'am." "Without proper registration, we don't know that," Diana said, adjusting her glasses. "You could be anyone." Dad stood up slowly. "I believe we met last month, Robert Davis, John's father." Susan's lips made a tight line. "Yes, the judge. Even more reason for you to respect our rules. Law experts should understand how important it is to follow rules." "Law experts also understand reasonable rules," Dad replied calmly, "and unreasonable ones." Mark stepped forward. "We're giving you a $500 fine for this. Pay it within 10 days. He handed me a pink paper. I almost choked. $500 because my parents visited without paperwork? "The first violation was a warning," Susan explained with fake patience. "Second violations have money penalties, as clearly stated in Section 7 of your agreement." "This is crazy," I said. "They're my parents, celebrating my birthday." "Rules are for everyone," Diana added, "or they mean nothing." Dad touched my arm gently. "John, may I see the exact rule they're talking about?" Susan's smile never reached her eyes. "Maybe you should look at the agreement you signed, Judge Davis. This isn't your courtroom. We have rules our community agreed on." Mark took pictures of my parents' car with his phone. "For our records." "Is that really necessary?" Mom asked, completely confused. "Yes," Susan replied. "We take pictures of all violations." They left after giving me the fine, walking back to the SUV. I saw neighbors watching from behind curtains. Some quickly disappeared when I looked their way. "I'm so sorry about this," I told my parents. "I had no idea they'd be this extreme." Dad looked at the fine carefully. $500 is too much for a simple visit? Have you read the whole agreement? I admitted I hadn't. Like most people, I'd quickly looked over the big document before signing. You've got a problem here, son, Dad said. This kind of behavior rarely gets better without doing something. Mom looked worried. Will we need to register every time we visit you? Absolutely not, I said firmly. This is getting out of control. That night, after cake and gifts, I couldn't sleep. I found my copy of the HOA agreement and started reading. The visitor registration rule existed, but it was for long stays and guests using community things, not family visits. The next morning, I walked to my neighbor Sam's house. He'd lived here for 5 years. Has the HOA always been this strict about visitors? I asked. Sam looked around nervously before answering. It got worse when Susan became president last year. Before that, the rules existed, but nobody enforced them like this. Has anyone fought her? The Ramirez family tried, when they were fined for having their grandparents stay during Christmas. They ended up with their trash not picked up for 3 weeks because of route confusion. Then they started getting landscaping violation notices every week. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox. Board meeting Tuesday, 7 p.m. You're requested to attend. It wasn't signed, but I knew Susan's handwriting from the fine notice. When I called Dad to tell him, he was strangely quiet. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking it's time we looked into exactly what powers your HOA actually has under county law. His voice had changed to what Mom called his courtroom tone. And more importantly, what powers they don't have. After we hung up, I saw an email. The HOA had sent me a copy of a message to all residents announcing new security rules, including background checks for visitors and ID cards for all guests using community things. The first line mentioned recent security concerns from unauthorized visitors. As I stared at my screen, another email came from an unknown address. Don't fight them, they always win. Then my phone got a text from an unknown number. Tuesday's meeting isn't optional if you want to stay in good standing. I looked out my window at the perfect lawns and identical mailboxes. For the first time, Willow Creek Homes didn't feel like a dream neighborhood anymore. It felt like a trap. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. It was my sister, Kate. Her voice was shaking. Jake, my water broke. The baby's coming 6 weeks early. I jumped out of bed. Stay calm, I'm coming to get you right now. Kate and her husband, Tom, were staying at my house because their own home was being fixed. The doctor had said the baby wouldn't come until next month. I ran to their room and helped Kate to my car, while her husband, Tom, got their hospital bag. Her face twisted in pain as she had another contraction. Breathe, Kate, I said, squeezing her hand. We'll be at the hospital in 15 minutes. As I backed out of my driveway, headlights suddenly blinded me. A black SUV blocked my way. Susan Smith got out, followed by Mark and 2 other HOA board members. Going somewhere with unregistered guests? Susan asked, pointing at Kate, who was moaning in the passenger seat. My sister is having a baby, I shouted. Move your car now. Susan crossed her arms. You should have thought about emergencies before breaking our rules so many times. Tom ran up. Please, our baby is coming early. We need to get to the hospital. Mark took out his phone and started recording. More violations to write down. I couldn't believe what was happening. Are you serious? This is a medical emergency. Rules don't change for emergencies, Susan said, looking at her watch. I'll need to see a doctor's note proving this isn't just another way to avoid our visitor rule. Kate screamed from the car. I saw blood on her pants. Call an ambulance, I yelled to Tom, who already had his phone out. Susan's face showed uncertainty for the first time, but she didn't move her car. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, watching. Mrs. Wilson from across the street hurried over in her bathrobe. Susan, what are you doing? That woman needs medical help. Stay out of this, Doris, Susan snapped. This is HOA business. 10 very long minutes passed before we heard sirens. The paramedics had to park on the street and roll a stretcher around Susan's SUV. They quickly checked Kate and put her in the ambulance. I'm coming with you, Tom said, climbing in beside his wife. I turned to Susan, who was still blocking my driveway. Move your car now. The board has voted, she announced loudly for the crowd to hear. Because of your repeated violations, all unregistered guests are banned from Willow Creek Homes. Your family is no longer welcome here. The neighbors gasped. You can't ban someone's family from visiting, Mrs. Wilson protested. Actually, we can, Mark said, holding up a tablet. Section 47.3 gives the board emergency powers to protect community rules. I needed to get to the hospital, not argue with these power-crazy people. My father will hear about this. Susan smirked. Oh yes, the judge. Tell him his title means nothing here. We have our own laws. Finally, she moved her SUV. I sped to the hospital, hands shaking with anger. Kate had a tiny but healthy baby girl an hour later. While she rested, I called my father. Dad, you won't believe what just happened. I explained everything. The phone went silent for so long I thought we'd lost the connection. Dad, are you there? I'm here. His voice was very calm. Text me Susan and Mark's full names and addresses. What are you going to do? Nothing illegal, he said. But no one threatens my family or puts my new granddaughter in danger. That evening, while Kate and the baby slept, my father came to the hospital. He didn't look like the relaxed man who cooked hamburgers at our cookout. This was Judge Robert Davis, who had sent criminals to jail and faced down corrupt politicians. I've made some calls, he said quietly. The county record office has some interesting information about Willow Creek Homes. What kind of information? Tom asked. Dad took out his laptop. Their HOA was set up wrong. Half their rules were never properly filed with the county, and Susan Smith has been signing official papers using a title she's not legally allowed to have. Can that help us? I asked. It's just the beginning, Dad said, his eyes showing determination. I've also found out that Mark Green's landscaping company has a contract with the HOA. Funny coincidence, since he's on the board that approves those contracts. A plan was forming. I could tell Dad had that look he got before making a big ruling. Jake, I need you to do something, he said. When you get home, check your mailbox. There should be a letter about your property taxes. Why does that matter? Because, Dad said with a slight smile, your property taxes pay for the county government, which has power over HOAs, and I happen to know someone who is in charge of the county oversight committee. As we talked, my phone got text messages. Neighbors were sending pictures of Susan and Mark putting orange cones at the entrance to our subdivision, with a sign that read, Visitor Checkpoint. All guests must show HOA approval. They've lost their minds, I muttered, showing Dad the pictures. He nodded seriously. What they're doing isn't just mean, some of it is actually illegal. When visiting hours ended, Dad insisted on driving me home. As we got near Willow Creek Homes, we saw the checkpoint. Mark sat in a folding chair, checking IDs against a clipboard. Your father can enter, Mark said when I rolled down my window. But he needs to register for future visits. New policy. Dad leaned across me. Under whose authority are you stopping access to a public road? Mark puffed up. The HOA board's authority. Interesting, Dad said mildly, because according to county records, this entrance road is public property paid for by county tax dollars. Mark's smile faded. That's not, check your facts. Dad interrupted. I already have. We drove through without another word, but this fight was far from over. In my mailbox, just as Dad predicted, was a letter about property taxes. But there was something else. A certified letter from the HOA. I tore it open and felt my blood pressure go up. They're fining me $1,500 for a pattern of visitor violations and threatening to take my house if I don't pay within 30 days. I told Dad. He took the letter, read it carefully, and folded it neatly. Perfect. This is exactly what we needed. How is this good news? Dad put a hand on my shoulder. Because they've put their illegal actions in writing, son. And that's exactly what a judge likes to see. I woke to the sound of car doors slamming outside my house. Looking through the blinds, I saw 3 official-looking cars with county government signs parked in front of the HOA community center across the street. Men and women in business clothes carried boxes and briefcases inside. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Wilson. "Something big happening at HOA office. Susan looks furious." I quickly got dressed and hurried outside. A small group of neighbors had gathered, watching as county officials went into the building. Susan stood at the door, her face red, arguing with a tall woman in a gray suit. "You can't just barge in here demanding documents," Susan shouted. "This is private property." "Actually, Miss Smith," the woman replied, holding up papers, "this is a legal inspection under County Code 43.7. We have the power to review all financial and operational records." Mark rushed up, still in his bathrobe. "What's going on?" "The County Oversight Committee is doing a surprise audit," someone whispered. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was my father, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone who'd been at the hospital until late last night. "Morning, son," he said casually. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I stared at him. "Did you do this?" His expression stayed neutral. "Let's just say I made a phone call to an old friend about some concerns. Judge Martinez is in charge of the County HOA Oversight Committee." "I didn't even know there was such a committee." "Most people don't," Dad said. "That's how certain HOAs get away with going too far." Susan spotted us watching and stormed over, pointing a finger at my father. "You! This is your doing, isn't it? Well, you'll find nothing wrong with our records." Dad smiled pleasantly. "Then you have nothing to worry about, Miss Smith." Susan's eyes narrowed. 20 years, I've run this community without interference. We keep property values high. We keep out undesirables. We exclude family members from visiting their loved ones, Dad interrupted. Create made-up rules without proper legal basis. "Our attorneys will fight this," she hissed. "I look forward to seeing them in court," Dad replied, still smiling. "Perhaps they can explain why your HOA has been operating with rules that were never properly filed with the county recorder." Susan's face went pale. She went back to the community center without another word. Throughout the day, neighbors knocked on my door, looking for information. Apparently, word had spread that my father was somehow behind the investigation. I explained what I could, without revealing details Dad had shared privately. By afternoon, strange rumors spread through Willow Creek Homes. Someone claimed the HOA had been charging too much for fees for years. Another neighbor heard that Mark's landscaping company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars for work that was never done. At 3 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young woman with a press badge. "Jake Davis, I'm Taylor Roberts from the County Chronicle. I'm doing a story on HOA oversight. Would you like to comment on the investigation happening in your community?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Kate, calling from the hospital. "The baby's oxygen levels dropped," she said, her voice breaking. "They've moved her to intensive care. Can you come?" "I'll be right there," I said, then turned to the reporter. "I'm sorry, family emergency." As I grabbed my keys, I spotted Susan and Mark near my driveway, watching. "Going somewhere?" Susan called out. "Perhaps to see those unregistered family members?" I was in no mood for their games. My newborn niece is in intensive care. Do you really want to block me again? The ban is still in effect, Mark said smugly. Your family is not welcome here. Something inside me snapped. I walked up to them, phone recording in my pocket. Let me make this absolutely clear, I said, keeping my voice steady. If you stop me from visiting my family during a medical emergency again, I will personally make sure that every news station in this county knows your names and faces. Susan stepped back, startled by my tone. Furthermore, I continued, the county investigators have already requested to talk to all board members. I suggest you prepare to explain why you're using HOA power to carry out personal grudges. I drove to the hospital, very angry, but focused on Kate and the baby. My father was already there, comforting Tom in the waiting room. They've stabilized her, Dad told me. She's going to be okay. Relief washed over me. Thank goodness. While Kate rested and Tom sat with the baby, Dad pulled me aside. The investigation is turning up more than expected, he said quietly. The county found financial records hidden in a separate filing cabinet. Mark's landscaping company received 3 times the market rate for services, and Susan approved payments to a consulting firm owned by her sister. So they're stealing from us, I said, disgusted. It appears so, and there's more. They've been selectively enforcing rules based on personal preferences. Mrs. Wilson filed 3 complaints about harassment when she questioned fee increases, but the board dismissed them without looking into it. By evening, we returned to Willow Creek Homes to find the community in an uproar. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for 7 p.m. Every homeowner received notice, a big difference from previous meetings held during work hours, when few could attend. The community center was packed. I grabbed a seat near the back, noticing the county officials observing from the corner. Susan and the board members sat at a table, looking uncomfortable. Due to concerns raised by residents and county officials, Susan began stiffly, we're having this emergency meeting to answer questions about HOA operations. A neighbor stood up immediately. Is it true you've been giving contracts to companies you personally benefit from? That claim is under review, Susan responded through clenched teeth. What about banning family members from visiting? Someone else called out. My grandkids aren't allowed to visit me anymore. Mark leaned into his microphone. The visitor policy protects all residents from... From what? Interrupted Mrs. Wilson. From having loved ones nearby? That policy wasn't voted on by homeowners. The meeting became chaotic as years of frustrations poured out. People shared stories of unfair fines, denied renovation requests, and threats. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see the county reporter, Taylor Roberts, sitting behind me. Quite a story unfolding here, she whispered. Care to comment now? Before I could answer, Susan's voice cut through the noise. This is all happening because of him. She pointed directly at me. Jake Davis and his judge father are trying to destroy everything we've built. They're outsiders who don't understand our community values. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, aware that whatever I said next would be quoted in tomorrow's newspaper. I moved here because I loved this community, I began quietly. All I wanted was for my family to visit occasionally, without being treated like criminals. People nodded in agreement. But this isn't about visitor policies anymore, I continued. It's about being responsible. It's about whether a small group of people can create their own laws and enforce them however they please. Susan jumped up. You have no proof of wrongdoing. This is ruining my reputation. That's when the tall woman from the county stepped forward. Actually, Miss Smith, we have a lot of evidence of financial wrongdoing. This meeting is now over until our investigation is complete. The county is temporarily freezing all HOA funds and suspending the board's authority. Gasps echoed through the room. Mark dropped his head into his hands, As people filed out in stunned silence, my father appeared beside me. "Tomorrow will be interesting," he said. "The county judge has agreed to hear an emergency request about the visitor ban." "Will it work?" I asked. Dad's expression was serious but hopeful. "Susan and her board have been operating outside their legal authority for years. It's time someone called them to account. Susan and Mark corners us at the exit." "You have declared war with wrong people," Susan hissed. "We have connections." Dad replied, "So do I. The difference is that mine are all within the law." As we walked, I got a news alert. County launches criminal probe into Willow Creek HOA. Board members face fraud charges. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt hope that justice might actually prevail. Rain pounded against the windows of the packed community center. I squeezed through the crowd, spotting Susan whispering urgently to Mark in the corner. When my father walked in, the room went silent. His gray hair was damp from the storm, but his eyes were clear and determined as he placed a thick folder on the table. "Who invited him?" Susan snapped, her voice shrill with panic. "This meeting is for residents only." My neighbor, Rose, stood up. "I invited him. We all did." She looked around the room at the nodding faces. "We're tired of being bullied." Susan's face turned red. "This is completely against procedure. Mark, call security." Mark didn't move. He was staring at the folder my father had brought. Dad stepped forward. "My name is Judge Robert Davis. My son lives here, and I'm deeply concerned about how this HOA is being run." "We don't care who you are," Susan cut in. "You have no authority here." "Actually," my father said, opening his folder, "I have copies of every HOA financial record for the past 5 years. Would you like to explain why $43,000 of community funds were transferred to Coastal Dynamics LLC last year?" Mark's coffee cup crashed to the floor. Several people gasped. My father continued, "A company that, interestingly, was incorporated by your husband, Mrs. Smith?" Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's confidential information. How did you get that?" "Public records," Dad replied simply. "Just like the county property maps showing that the community landscaping project last summer was mainly done on board members' properties." An older gentleman stood up. "Is that why our request to fix the playground was denied? There wasn't enough money?" Dad nodded. "And that's just the beginning. I've uncovered at least 16 separate violations of state law in how this HOA operates." He turned to face the crowd directly. "But what truly bothers me is the unfair enforcement of rules. My son's family was banned from visiting, yet when board member Schmidt's extended family stayed for 3 weeks last summer, no action was taken." Several people shouted in agreement. I spotted Mrs. Schmidt sinking lower in her chair. "This stops now," my father declared. "I've prepared formal complaints with both the county prosecutor and the state attorney general's office." Susan lunged for the folder. "You have no right." 2 residents stepped between them. The room erupted into shouting. "Order! Order!" Martin banged a gavel frantically. Mrs. Patel, who I barely knew, stood up. "My husband is an accountant. He's been questioning the HOA finances for years, but was always ignored. Can I see those records?" Dad handed her a copy. "Page 37 is particularly interesting." Susan's face had gone from red to white. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. "No, it's not," said Rose firmly. "According to our bylaws, we can call for an emergency vote to remove board members. I so move." "Second," called voices from around the room. Susan grabbed her purse. "This is ridiculous. You'll all be hearing from our lawyer." As she stormed toward the exit, Dad called out, "Mrs. Smith, you might want to delay that call. The county fraud investigator would like to speak with you first. He's waiting outside." Susan froze at the door. Through the window, we could all see a woman in a dark suit standing next to a police car. "You set me up," she whispered, turning to face me. Her eyes were full of hatred. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." My father looked at her calmly. "No, Mrs. Smith, this is accountability. Martin pushed me, 'You will never sell your house.' Mrs. Patel's daughter got that on video." The door open, county investigators. "Susan, Martin, questions about finances." Martin suddenly pushed through the crowd toward me. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "I have friends in every real estate office in this county. You'll never sell your house, and your property values will crash when I'm done spreading rumors about this neighborhood." Before I could respond, someone's phone flashed. "Got that threat on video," said Mrs. Patel's teenage daughter with a smile. "Should I post it now or wait?" The door opened, and the county investigators stepped in from the rain. "Susan Smith and Mark Green," she called. "I'd like to ask you some questions about Willow Creek Estate's financial records." As they were led away, the remaining board members huddled together in panic. What started as a simple fight over family visits had unraveled their entire power structure in a single stormy night. But something told me this battle wasn't completely over yet, and maybe the worst part was still to come. "Breaking news from Willow Creek Estates," announced the TV reporter, standing in front of my house. "In a shocking development, 5 HOA board members are facing criminal charges, following what began as a dispute over family visitation rights." I clicked off the TV as my doorbell rang. 3 weeks had passed since the explosive community meeting, and nothing had been the same since. "You've got visitors," said Officer Jenkins with a smile. The police had been driving through our neighborhood regularly since Susan and Mark were released on bail. Their conditions included staying 500 feet away from my property. My sister Mary ran up the driveway with her kids. "No clipboard police stopping us today," she laughed, hugging me tightly. "Come in," I said, glancing nervously at Susan's house across the street. The windows were dark, but I sometimes felt she was watching. Inside, my neighbor Rose sat with my father, reviewing documents. "We found something huge," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Remember that community pool project that was canceled 3 years ago? The HOA collected over $200,000 for it, which mysteriously disappeared," Dad added, spreading out bank statements. "We traced it to an account in Bermuda." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off or your house burns next." I showed it to Officer Jenkins, who immediately called it in. "That's the 4th threat this week," he said grimly. "We're taking this seriously." "They're scared," Dad said. "The county prosecutor is offering plea deals to board members who testify against Susan and Mark." A car screeched to a halt outside. Mark stormed up my walkway, ignoring the restraining order. "You ruined everything," he shouted through the door. 15 years building this community, and you destroy it in a month." Officer Jenkins stepped outside. "Sir, you need to leave immediately." "This neighborhood was perfect before they moved in," Mark yelled, pointing at me. Mrs. Patel appeared from next door. "Perfect? My family endured 3 years of random inspections after we put up Diwali decorations. Tell them about that perfection." Other neighbors emerged from their homes, forming a protective circle. "These people destroyed our property values," Mark cried desperately. "Actually," said Mr. Washington from across the street, "I just got an offer on my house, $20,000 above asking. Turns out people want to live in communities without corrupt HOAs." Mark's face crumpled as police cruisers pulled up. They led him away as neighbors applauded. That evening, a knock came at my back door. I opened it to find Mrs. Schmidt, the former board secretary, looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, "but you need to know. Susan kept files on everyone. She's planning something at tomorrow's court hearing." "What kind of files?" I asked. "Blackmail, photographs, personal information. She has something on the judge assigned to your case." I called my father immediately. He made some calls, and by morning, the judge had removed himself from the case. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters the next day. Susan appeared in an expensive suit, looking confident, until she saw the new judge enter. A stern woman my father had never met. Someone not influenced by Susan. Inside, Susan's lawyer stood dramatically. "Your Honor, this entire case is a personal vendetta by Judge Davis against my client for simply enforcing community rules." The new judge peered over her glasses. "I've reviewed the evidence. This appears to be a clear case of financial fraud, not a dispute over rules." Susan whispered frantically to her lawyer, who tried a different approach. "My client was merely following established practices set by previous boards." "Fascinating defense," the judge remarked. "Essentially, others committed fraud before me, so my fraud should be excused." The courtroom erupted in laughter, which died when Susan suddenly stood. "I want to change my plea," she announced. Her lawyer looked shocked. "I'll testify against everyone," Susan continued, her voice breaking. "The developers, the county inspectors who took bribes, all of it, in exchange for immunity." The prosecutor leaned forward. "What developers?" And that's when the real bombshell dropped. Susan revealed a decade-long scheme involving kickbacks from developers, falsified inspection reports, and county officials taking bribes. Willow Creek Estates was just one of 17 communities affected. 6 months later, I sat in my backyard, watching my nieces and nephews splash in our new community pool, funded by the recovered stolen money. "You know, it's funny," said Rose, handing me a lemonade. "All Susan had to do was let your family visit, and none of this would have happened." Dad joined us, tossing the newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Former HOA president sentenced to 7 years. County commissioner resigns in disgrace." "Sometimes the smallest injustices reveal the biggest crimes," he said thoughtfully. My phone buzzed with a notification. I'd been elected president of our new, transparent HOA board.